Well, I had a hard 4 years after I published The Truest Pleasure because I had gotten so deeply into that character. Somewhat like an actor. I've said before that writing and acting are very close, and it's not an accident that the greatest writer in English was also an actor. So in a sense, you're acting in your mind these characters. But I had lived with Jenny's voice so long I couldn't get out of it. Every time I started writing, it's that voice that came back. So I wrote poetry. I tried writing short stories. I had lived out of the South for several years. I teach at Cornell, taught at Cornell, but I was at Davidson College in the spring of 1998, and maybe listening to people, meeting people. One day, I thought I knew this character was very shy. She didn't have a lot of confidence. She was a quiet person. Jenny was a very talkative person. And I thought, okay, now Julie can talk about how she's not a good storyteller. She can just be upfront about it. And I heard, I know about my senior because I was there. And she starts talking about the death of her brother. And that is a real incident. My grandmother, Julie Levi Capps, Capps Levi, I'm sorry, had a younger brother who did die choked on worms. And I described that. She describes that. By the way, I actually have had a response from the family of the doctor who treated him. They were the King family. I called them the Prince family. And once in Atlanta, I met this man just outside the lecture hall who had a book to sign, and he was descended from the doctor. I guess he had read in the newspaper about that story. But what's the word? Exhilarating, I think, to let Julie tell her story and to try to get into the mind of somebody with that level of education who saw the world in the late 19th century, as she did. It's an act of sympathetic imagination. How would they think? It'd be very different from being a college professor in 1998. What sort of experiences, what does she value? What means the most to her? And obviously her husband, and also the church, eventually. She is inspired by my grandmother, who spent her life helping other people. Her parents, her father, her husband, her children. I can remember that grandmother. She was the grandma who died of a brain tumor in early 1948. I remember her funeral. I did not base her husband that closely on my grandpa, but I took some of his features and exaggerated them. He was somebody full of himself, and he liked to have his way with things. But it really took off when, let's see, I tried to visualize Gap Creek at that time. My mother was born there in Gap Creek in South Carolina, and it was a notorious bootlegging place, moonshining. When I published the book and it was chosen by Oprah and I was on television, people heard about my writing that had never paid any attention to the poetry. I had very good response to that book from the people there. They were kind of proud of it. And the only negative comment I got was from somebody descended from a family who had lived on Gap Creek who had not been mentioned. They said, well, you didn't mention them at all. And I apologized. I didn't work into that family, but though the reception was positive, I was once called to somebody's house, and I wondered what they wanted to say. Were they going to be furious about something? And finally, the gentleman said, "Well, I read Gap Creek, and it's the best novel I ever read, but it's the only novel I ever read," he said. But yeah, I was pleased at that response from the people themselves. They were particularly pleased by the language. and by the word choice. Well, that's what makes a story is the conflict, the challenge. Stories are not made of placidity. They're made of trouble. I used to tell students that when you've got somebody in trouble, you've got the potential story, because the story is about how they deal with the trouble, how they deal with the crisis. Somebody once said, when did literature get so bloody? And I said, well, maybe it started with the Iliad. But it is the conflict and how people deal with it. That is the crux of fiction. Any sort of film, television, novels, short stories, plays. That's what we like to read, or hear stories about how people deal with trouble. In some ways, the paradigm for fiction is the detective story. You've got a problem, and how do you, if you don't solve it, at least how you explain it. I guess an old teacher of mine who taught screenwriting said, you got a story when you got somebody who wants something real bad and it's hard to get. It doesn't matter if it's $1 billion in the bank, or they're in jail trying to get out, or it's the blonde down the street. It's how they achieve that. That is the story. But the book I am working on, and have been working on for 6 years, is a biography of Edgar Allan Poe. It's called Fallen Angel, the life of Edgar Allan Poe. So see, I got to it. Originally, I wanted to write a biography of Boone and of Poe, and I did eventually get to it. It's a big job. The kinds of things I've done that probably other biographers haven't done is I emphasize his obsession with marriage, with the horror of marriage, as well as the ideal of marriage, and that Poe was a writer about the world of nature. That's usually not known or observed, that he could write about the world of nature about as well as his New England contemporaries, though he didn't write as often. I'm interested in his concerns with the ethnicity of his mother, who was an actress from London, and it seems that Poe believed her family were Jewish. We have absolutely no proof that that's true, but he drops hints all over the place. And whether that's right or not, I don't know, but he seemed very interested in dropping those hints. He couldn't say so explicitly in an anti-Semitic world, but I thought that was very interesting. Other biographers have noted it, but passed over it. But I thought that was something to go into just a little bit. I don't spend a lot of time on that. I think he died of tubercular meningitis, not of alcohol poisoning, and other biographers, I think, agree with that now. But the great fun has been to watch the evolution of his writing. He's a brilliant poet by the age of 18. Very rare. Then he becomes not only the forerunner of symbolist poetry, but of criticism, analytical criticism, the science fiction story, invents the detective story, all in a career that ended at the age of 40. It's an incredible story. Against great odds, he had never gone to Harvard. He had no money. His parents were strolling players. He was from the South, not an advantage at that time. But he also was such a brilliant critic that he made himself notorious for the toughness of his criticism. He was called the Tomahawk Man, or the literary Comanche. Fallen Angel, the life of Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, there is something angelic about him, but it's also a fallen angel. His life was anything but angelic. Tremendous problems. Bipolar, probably. Had a problem with alcohol, certainly. Married his first cousin when she was 13, and he was 26. Unusual life, to say the least.